And joining us now from London is one of the founder, James Arbib. Very welcome.
Hello there. Very good to be with you. Thank you.
Um, James, your thoughts, one could guess, might be rather provoking to the world leaders of today. How can you be so sure of your predictions?
I wouldn't say we're certain in the exact outcomes that we predict, but what we are certain of is the direction of travel and the way that change happens. Really, the expertise we have at RethinkX is in understanding how change happens. And a lot of the forecasts we see from governments or from NGOs are what we might term simple systems forecasts, right? They're not dealing with the kind of complexity of change. So if I kind of distill the framework that we use to understand individual sectors of the economy or even society as a whole, it really comes down to three elements that you need to understand if you want to understand how change happens. So firstly is about the process of change. So we know that change tends to be, well, change is non-linear. Right, so you get an S curve of technology disruption in a sector. So you get new technologies adopted in an S curve, and what's driving that are feedback loops, and these tend to be ignored from mainstream analysis. So you get a virtuous cycle for a new industry where you get new products and services adopted, you get increasing economies of scale, you get reducing costs, you get more investment flooding into the sector. I mean, we see that in the car industry right now, where all the investments moving from gasoline cars into electric and autonomous vehicles. You get talent moving from the old industry to the new industry. You get regulations supporting the new industry, supply chains getting built out, and so on and so forth. You get this kind of virtuous cycle that drives the improvement in the new and the adoption of the new. And the old goes into the reverse. You get a kind of death spiral, a vicious cycle of decreasing economies of scale and increasing costs and reducing demand and so on and so forth. And those are the forces that drive the S curves. We tend not to analyze or understand those. The second point to make, and I think it's probably the most profound one that we tend to miss, is about the nature of change. And Buckminster Fuller once said, there's nothing about a caterpillar that tells you it's going to be a butterfly. And that's an analogy we use when we think about change, because the current system in many ways is a caterpillar. We understand it very deeply. We know exactly what's going on in that system. And we tend to assume that system is going to carry on ad infinitum into the future. We kind of extrapolate it forward. But when change comes, it's really transformative. Everything changes. It's not just a substitution of technology, but the business model, the infrastructure, the very possibilities of what can be achieved with that technology transform. And it's a very, very different place. And so, when we look at, say, the energy sector, we tend to assume that what we're doing is swapping out coal or gas for, solar or batteries and wind and so on. And it's just a simple substitution, and that's not what happens at all. What you get when you build a new energy system is something that looks very different. It's much more distributed. It's much more dynamic. We think you size the system for the darkest day of winter to deal with the shortage of solar, for instance, during the winter. And you can do that economically. It's the cheapest system you can build because the cost of solar, wind and batteries are dropping so precipitously and will continue to do so. But when you build a system like that every other day of the year, other than the darkest day of winter, you get a kind of superabundance of energy, more energy than you need, which is free energy. And in the current system, we see that as a problem. In the new system, it's a huge opportunity, we think. We think demand will respond to that incentive of zero cost energy for much of the year, and it will change usage patterns, change how we use energy. And it will create huge new opportunities for industries. That leads me on to the third point, which is about the impact of change. So when you get change in one part of the system, it cascades out across other parts of the system. And so, that new energy system, for instance, will create opportunities in all kinds of other industries. I mean, if you think of the internet, for instance, it was a revolution in kind of communications mainly, and it didn't just disrupt the communications industries. It created a host of new opportunities across pretty much every other sector of the economy and transformed how they did business and how they functioned. Now we think the same disruptions are coming to transportation, to energy, to food and agriculture, to pretty much every sector of the economy. And we're going to see a fundamental transformation. And we're just generally blind to the kind of scale of change that's coming to us.
But in a way, these are things that are obvious, that are happening around us. Why would you say that leaders are incapable of understanding this fully out or to react upon the changes that are coming and the way they evolve?
Yeah, so I mean, when we tend to look forward, what we tend to do is look back to start, and we kind of draw a straight line to today, and then we extrapolate it into the future. And we assume maybe one element of the system changes, a new technology is coming along, but all else remains equal. Now, of course, that's essentially a heuristic, and it works fine most of the time, because you think of our energy system or our food system or our transport system, they've been essentially in some kind of temporary equilibrium for over 100 years now. Same business model, the same basis of technology, same infrastructure, and so on. Sure, we've seen huge technological advances, but the system's essentially the same. So you can essentially extrapolate the past into the future, and it's not a bad approximation for the future. But when you come up to a period of transformation, which we think we are in all of those sectors, it becomes woefully inadequate. And I think what we're doing is building our expectations based on essentially these false assumptions. And because they're so ingrained, you see in Wall Street banks and governments and NGOs and so on, we make the same mistakes, that we're taking decisions based essentially on faulty data and faulty expectations of the future.
But we take decision based on our knowledge, of course, and in that way our history. Could you just change this system, which is the fundamentals of the economic system of today, without creating chaos?
You can. I think the way we see change happening, I think is fundamentally different, perhaps, to how often governments see it happening. And I'm going to use quite a controversial analogy here. I hope you don't mind me doing this, but I see it as a difference between a creationist view of the world and an evolutionary view of the world. And just bear with me a second. I think we often think that there's some kind of intelligent designer, like the government, say, an all-powerful being that can somehow pull the strings from the center and direct change. And it's the role of government to sort out our problems and to lead us into the future. And our view is the opposite. It's upside down. It's an evolutionary process. And of course, the mechanisms of evolution are variation and selection. And what happens is we get change from the bottom, essentially. It's emergent. And that we conduct experiments, and the best experiments win out and spread. And the job of government is incredibly important. It's to create the evolutionary context for that process to happen. And sure, regulation's important, and tax and subsidy and the other tools in the arsenal of governments are important. But it's not a top-down mechanism. We think it's very much a bottom-up mechanism, and so it's a different perspective really on how we guide change and how change can happen.
But you're also talking about bridging the transformation, sort of I don't know, to take away some of the negative consequences, or in a way making it smoother. Is that a way of describing it? What is it that needs to be bridged?
Well, so we have a current system. We've built everything around it, and I'm not just talking about an energy system or a transport system. I'm talking about the very basis of our society, the economic system, the social and political systems we have, which all kind of co-evolved with this what we call an extraction-based production system that we have today. That determines kind of centralization and scale and reach that you need in such a society. We're moving, we think, to a very, very different system of production, one that's far more distributed, where the inputs, the photons, the electrons, the cells, the molecules, and so on, are available everywhere in abundance. So you can have a much more self-sufficiency at local level. We move to a world we think of what we call the network and the node, a series of somewhat independent and self-sufficient nodes interconnected globally, essentially through information flows. So it's a fundamentally different production system emerging. But bridging between those two states is a difficult thing because the scale of change is so profound. We think we'll see industries transformed over that period of time, which means, destruction of value, destruction of jobs and communities and everything that comes with it. And so it's going to be a hugely unsettling and destabilized period of time. And so our job in many ways is to ensure that it happens in the smoothest possible ways. And we can do that by essentially providing the North Star, the kind of light at the end of the tunnel that guides us through, that shows us where we're going to get to, but also by providing protection to individuals, to people, to help them through that change, to provide the security and whatever else they need to take away the fear of change and ensure they're able to provide for themselves.
You're talking about a we that should support us with the Northern Star. Who is we in this context?
We as society more generally, we as those people who are concerned about building that new world, that world that potentially is much more prosperous, much more resilient, much more equitable. But it's a fundamentally different world. I mean, it is the butterfly to today's caterpillar, and it's going to require all kinds of change that we can't even comprehend today. Not just to individual sectors of the economy, but to society more generally.
James Arbib will take that thought, the caterpillar becoming a butterfly, with us. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.